Okay, as we begin today, I have in my notes that in May of 1984, Daniel Broken Legs was saved. And Dan is quite an individual, and I'd like to go back and share. I had known Dan ever since we moved into Pine Ridge. He lived about a half a block from me in a little house over northeast of our house, and he was an old pipe maker. He made peace pipes, and our friendship over the years, as we began, he cut his pipe stone with a handsaw. Now, this pipe stone is normally 1.25 inches, 1 3/4 thick, and it may be a slab 2 or 3 feet square. And the pipe is normally 6-8 inches long, with a bowl that sticks up at a 90-degree angle, probably 3 or 4 inches. And so to cut this out with a handsaw would take a lot of pipe stone and a lot of waste, because you could not, if you just laid it out on the slab, you'd have to be able to have straight cuts for your handsaw. Well, I got to watching Dan, and our friendship was such that I said, Dan, I think that if you'd let me help you, I could help you cut this and get more stone, more pipes out of your stone, because I could use my skill saw with a stone cutting blade, and I could also use my saber saw. And so I explained to him, and he kind of had a question in his mind until he saw what I could do. And we ended up, he had waste less than 4 inches square out of a piece of, he would have several of these pieces, but we could put the pipe bowls together and cut between them, and anyway, his waste, he got nearly twice as many pipes out of the pipe stones. And so once he saw what I was doing, I cut all of his pipe stones, and I'd ask him, I'd say, well, Dan, you need to mark out how you want them cut. And he said, no, he said, I want as many pipes as we can out of the stone, and you just do it. And one of the first ones he had me do, he said, I want you to make this to where the stem, normally the stems are out of wood, and he said, I want you to make this one with a stem that'll be out of pipe stone. It'll all be one piece, and the pipe was probably 22 inches long, with the stem and then the bowl on one end of it. And so in the process, we became very good friends. And one day I was talking to him when I was cutting out one of these stones for him, and he said, I told him, I said, someday I'd like for you to teach me how to do this. And he kind of grinned, and he said, okay, I will. And so when I cut out this long pipe stone, I got all of these pipes together, and he took this long one, and he said, make me a pipe. And I had watched him, and kind of knew, and I also saw a challenge here, on his part. And so I put it in front of my TV set on the floor, and it laid there for nearly a year. And he'd come in and visiting with me, and he'd say, I see you haven't done anything on your pipe. And I said, yeah, I'm working on it. And he said, I don't see any hole in it, or I don't see it smooth. And I said, I'm thinking about it. And laugh and go on. And I went to a summer camp in South Carolina with an RAGA camp, and I took the pipe with me. And he told me, he said, I want you to inlay some mother of pearl in it. And so while I was down there, I took some, the angels or the birds that are in sand dollars. Okay. I took some of those and I embedded those in the bowl of that pipe. And when I came back, I had it finished. And he saw it, and I said, well, here's your pipe. And he grinned and he looked at it and he said, this one's yours. And I have that pipe back in the bedroom. But this is the kind of friendship. He came one evening, it was 10:30 at night, knocked on my door, and he had a .22 rifle, automatic. And he said, preacher, he said, I want you to keep this from me. He said, I'm afraid that somebody's going to steal it. And then he went on to say, and we had a lot of break-ins into homes and stealing of things. And these guys had come by with this brand new Remington 22 automatic rifle that they sold him for $20. And he said, I'm afraid that they'll come back and beat me up and take the gun. And so he said, I want you to keep it. And so I kept it for, I guess, a year or two. And one day he was over and he said, Harold, do you remember that I left that .22 rifle? And I said, yeah, I've got it back there in the bedroom. He said, I'm going to give that to you. And I still have that .22 rifle. As time went on, his little house that he had, just a 2-room, probably 12, 14 feet wide, 28 feet long, 2-room, caught on fire and burned. And so they had no place to go. They some friends and neighbors that they stayed first place from one another. And also about Dan worked with a foster grandparent program, which is a government-funded program to where the elderly can work as kind of as teachers, but as sharing the culture with the children, either in the schools or in the hospital. Some of the old grandmas would go up to the hospital and take these babies that were in there for first one reason or another, and sit in a rocking chair and feed them, and just the elderly would share a part of their culture with the kids, and Dan, of course, with his peacemaking, pipe making, was sharing this. Well, the foster grandparent program was always having trouble with funding and with someone to work with them and direct them and help them on the leadership end of it. And so Dan asked me if I would be willing to work on the board of directors. And so I told him, I said, well, yeah, I guess. But I said, I don't know anything about it. And So he came back the next day and he said, hey, he said, Harold, you're on the board of directors. They immediately, when I suggested you, and they needed someone that would help take care of their money. I mean, the finances, the government funds that came. Lots of times, when you get to messing with government funds, it disappears real easy. And so anyway, I worked for 22 years as a board member with the foster grandparents, and I got started doing it through Dan Brokenleg. Well, it was about this time that his home burned, and across the street from where we lived was an old house. It had been deserted, and people were literally cutting it up. They'd get up on the roof with an axe and cut the boards that were used underneath the shingles, cut those for firewood. I mean, they were literally tearing the house up, and so I'd run kids off of there several times, and I got to talking with some of my friends, and I found, and these are friends through the tribe. Gabby Brewer, in fact, was the individual that was in charge of helping work on houses to bring them up to livable standards. And so I was talking to Gabby one day, and I said, Gabby, what would be the chance of getting this old house over here fixed up for Dan Brokenleg? And he said, if we owned it, or somebody owned it, he said, Preacher, why don't you buy it? And so I got checking around, and I could buy it for $300. And so I told Gabby, and Gabby said, all right. He said, you go ahead and buy it for $300, and then we'll spend $5,000 building and getting ready for Dan and his wife. So I went to the church, and I said, here's a chance for us to share a ministry. So we bought, the church paid for it out of funds that we were given, but I took the monies and used my name instead of the church, and so we bought this house, and Gabby came in and they totally renovated, made a beautiful home out of it, and Dan lived right across the street from me. And so as the years went by, Dan was from the Rosebud Reservation. He was a Sioux, but he was from Rosebud, and he had a brother that was a lay reader and priest for the Catholic Church, and he was a Catholic, and he attended our church quite a bit, off and on, as we had opportunity to visit, and I just never talked to him about giving his heart to the Lord. He was a Catholic, and one day I was, and in this process with him, he had diabetes, and they began to do the thing that they did so much over there on the reservation. I don't know how much you know about diabetes, but diabetics have trouble with circulation of blood, especially in their hands and in their feet, and the feet first. And so the first thing they did was remove one of his big toes, and there was no circulation there. And then later they had to take half of his foot, the whole front half toes, had to take those off. And then later they had to take off one of his feet above the ankle. And then they started on the other foot, and they eventually had to take it just below the knee, or just above the knee. And so, and this happened over a series of time, but Dan was just such a close friend. And so one day I was visiting with Dan, and Dan told me, he said, "Harold, I want to give my heart to Jesus Christ." And so I shared the gospel with him, and at this time he had lost both legs. I shared the gospel with him, and he just immediately received the Lord. He was just so open to it. And I knew as soon as he gave his heart to the Lord, I knew what the next question was going to be. He said, "Brother Harold, can you baptize me?" Well, now here's a man with no legs. I mean, he's got artificials, but you don't take artificial legs into the baptistry, not back in the days when they were wood. And I said, sure. I said, "We'll baptize you." And so we made arrangements to baptize him. And Jim Taft, who was a kid from Oklahoma that I had known, had become a member of our church and married one of the girls that attended our church. So Jim and I set him in a wooden chair. And don't ever baptize in a wooden chair. They float. Really? But anyway, we carried Dan into the baptistry in the wooden chair, and then Jim stayed in the baptistry with me, and as instead of having him stand up, of course he was sitting down, and after I had talked to him about his profession of faith and his expression of his by following the Lord in baptism, I just eased him back. Well, when I eased him back, everything began to float, and Jim grabbed a hold of it. And anyway, we got him baptized and back up and out of the baptistry. But this old man was led to the Lord just through a daily living with him and working with him. It was just such a precious time with Dan. About that, in '85, we decided to have a revival, but we were also going to do a Bible conference where our evangelist would teach the Bible in the mornings, and then in the evenings we would have our revival services. And an Oklahoma Indian, a couple of Oklahoma Indians, Richard Carr, who was a Creek, and Ernest Best, who was also a Creek. And Ernest had come and helped me prior to this, when Wilbert Robertson came and with his daughter and her dummy Tommy Tomahawk, and but anyway, they came back and did this Bible conference and revival, and we had a number of people saved, and I think we had 15 or 20 in those morning Bible studies, and Ernest and Richard did a beautiful job with this. Along about this time, we had a white school teacher by the name of Bert Kilmer come to Pine Ridge, and he lived. His home was in Pierre, and but he was teaching down there. His wife still lived in Pierre, and he attended our church. He was a doll maker. He ceramic dolls, ceramic head, arms, legs, and that he made the bodies, dressed them, and this guy was, probably 55, 60 years old, but he was a professional. Some of his dolls sold for better than $1,000. I mean, they were, no. And so we met him. He attended church, and he was there for a year, I guess, or maybe two. And the neat thing about this was that we lost all contact with him. And even after I retired and we moved here to Hot Springs, we heard that there was a fella up at the Evans that would come to church if he had a ride. And so I called and made arrangements to come by and pick him up. And who in the world but here was Bert Kelmer, the guy that had been the school teacher, was now a veteran and was at the VA hospital, but he was living in Hot Springs. And he attended our church for a couple of years until he died. And but it's strange how that we had that relationship with him at Pine Ridge, and it followed up after our retirement. We had in '85 we had vacation Bible schools in Pine Ridge and had 298. And out at Ogallala we had 105 underneath the trees. And just that same summer we took 10 of our young people to Falls Creek. And this began to be a really important thing, not just going to camp, but these kids had a chance to see Indian leadership and Indian people really involved in their Christian lives. At that time, Falls Creek had 3,000 or 4,000 Indian people come. It was the largest Indian camp in the world, and Falls Creek is still going, and it has grown astronomically. In fact, when I was down in Oklahoma a year ago at that wild game feed down there, I went to one of their committee meetings with Ralph. They had 50 people in their committee meeting. It just, but I wanted our Lakota people to see that Indian people could operate in every area that the white man could. That there was more to it than just being a part of a mission on a reservation, but the people could really begin to serve the Lord. And so Falls Creek became a very big for us. And then in this same year, we had a couple, Tom and Ann Parker, come to Pine Ridge as lab techs. And Tom, they, as I said, they were both lab techs, but Tom came particularly because he loved to hunt and to hunt prairie dogs. And he found out that there was lots of prairie dogs on Pine Ridge, and so he came, and we got acquainted with them, and through Tom, I was always looking for the opportunity, the place to do mission work and get churches started and do what we could. And so I was talking to Tom one day, and I said, we've got these vacation Bible schools out there in Ogallala. I said, we're running over 100 kids underneath a bunch of shade trees along an old road. And if we could find property out there to where, he said, I'll bet you I know where you can get some. And he said, I hunt prairie dogs out there. And he said, let me check. So he was the person who was the head of the hospital. His father lived out at Ogallala, and he hunted prairie dog on him. And so he was talking to this fella, and his father was having trouble with people walking from the housing area across to the post office, cutting across their fences and tearing them down. And so he was complaining about having to deal with that. And he said, I don't know what I'm going to have to do, whether I'm going to have to sell this or what I'm going to do. But he said, I got to do something. And Tom said, hey, he said, I know a preacher in Pine Ridge that might be interested in buying that. And that was the initial thing, and we began to negotiate for 15.8 acres of land that we could put a fence on, to where the people would not tear down their fences. It would be parallel, and there was so we began to negotiate. And of course, to buy property, to buy land from the Indian people is almost an impossibility. It just can't be done. You can lease it, you can do that, but to get a clear title to it, and for over a year, we negotiated and worked with this, and finally, it worked out to where we could not get the 15 point. Because it had to be surveyed and all of this. In fact, we paid a surveyor to do some survey work, and the tribe wouldn't accept it. But they said, we can block you out 20 acres, a square instead of a triangle. And so they agreed with that, and we bought it. And it belongs to the Lakota Baptist Church. And Earl Headland, who I mentioned was a Mennonite missionary, had been there for years. I saw him one day, and he said, Harold, he said, I understand you leased some land out at Ogallala. And I said, no. I said, we bought it. He said, you can't. And I said, well, I'm sorry, Earl, but we do have it. He said, you can't get deeded land. And I said, well, maybe not, but in my safe deposit box there is a deed. And I said, we had it made out to the Lakota Baptist Church. And this was I had a philosophy, and it's still my philosophy. All of the properties are owned by the Lakota Baptist Church. The lease that is on the building in Pine Ridge is all operated by the Lakota Baptist Church. All of the other missionaries and all of the other reservations, it's owned by the Southern Baptist Convention or by the association or somebody. But my philosophy was and still is that if you get by a lot of hard feelings when they say, yeah, you Baptists come in and bought this property, and that was one of the things that wounded me. That was the Catholic Church had come in there and wiggled through one way or another. The cemetery and the church and everything was owned by the Catholic Church. And so I made it an objective that it was all in the hands of the Lakota Baptist Church. And and I think it was I think it was a wise direction. I think it's a wise direction for missions to take, because whenever they'd start saying something about you Baptists owning this or what, I said, whoa, this belongs to the Lakota Baptist Church, and the Lakota Baptist Church are Indian people, are Lakota people, and so we leased that property. We bought that 20 acres, and by the way, we bought it for $2,000, and the property's still out there. There's a little cemetery. Nothing's been. Eventually moved a building out there, a mobile chapel, and we're out there for several years, and we were not able to eventually get a pastor there. I was told that it was I shouldn't start any more little churches with pastors that needed to be supported by the Home Mission Board, and I'll not even go into that. But then in '85, Gary Hawkins and Jim Davis came to help us, again, Oklahoma Indian people, and we used a lot of these. In '86, we took 11 to Falls Creek, and we had our number of vacation Bible schools. And then we also had Tom Anderson, another Oklahoma Indian, and I kept using these Oklahoma Indian pastors and evangelists so that our people, our Lakota people, could see that these are Indian people in places of leadership. These are Indian people who are preachers, and I was trying to develop and help them to see that God could use them as well. And then in '87 we had another revival with Ernest Best back with us again, and we were also doing Indian youth camps, and I was the director of most of these for probably 25 years, these it was at one of these youth camps, in fact one over in the eastern part of the state, that I was walking along with the pastor from I got a senior moment here, but anyway, the missionary from up at Eagle Butte, he and I were walking out across and just along the road, and I fell, and my hands did not come up to catch me. I fell and I hit on the left part of my face, just above my eye, broke my glasses, and this was the beginning of within a year or so I would be diagnosed with Parkinson's, and but that was the beginning of it. And then right along, that was in '87, and in August of that year I had my second knee surgery, total knee surgery, and then we had a lot of health problems during '87, '88. Deloris developed some heart problem, and took her to Denver to have some tests and stuff run, and we were not aware that she was allergic to iodine, and the dye that they used for this test was iodine, and she straight lined 3 times during that test. And it was also during this time that I was having difficulty with tremors pretty bad with my hands. And while I was down in Denver, we went to the University of Colorado's Medical Center, and I met Dr. O'Brien, and he checked me over and did all of the regular things about having you touch your nose and all this, and watched me walk and all this. And he said, I want to give you a pill. And he said, I want you to chew this pill up and come back in about an hour. And I did that, and my tremors were gone. And then is when he hit me with the thing that I had Parkinson's. And but I'll never forget, he said, now, Harold, you have Parkinson's. And he said, you'll have it forever. He said, it's never going to go away. He said, I suggest you get into a Parkinson's support group, that you find out as much as you can about Parkinson's. But he said, I want you to know that this is not the end of the world. He said, you can live with Parkinson's and live a not a normal life, but he said you can live a productive life. And from that experience with him, I was able to really get a handle on my Parkinson's, and I still remember his instruction and everything that he did to help me to realize that you can have Parkinson's and still live with it. I was diagnosed in '88. It's been 22 years, and I still live a fairly productive life. And so that year we took 6 kids to Falls Creek again, and it was in November of that year. Like I said, this was kind of a year we had a lot of medical things. I had to have a total knee done. Now, I'd already had on both my knees. You can only have, 2 total knees. But they had to go back in and replace one of the pads in in my first knee. It had worn out. And it was supposed to have been a new product that was heat treated, and it deteriorated on the inside, and so I had to have that done again. And whenever they go back and do this, it's the same surgery, the same operation as a total knee, only they just open your knee up and take out the old pad, put a new pad in, and but the rehabilitation program is exactly the same. And I've had this done on my knees 3 times on each knee, and still going. And if they ever go out again, I'm headed for the next time. It was this year, in '88, that I had mentioned Steve Simpson many times, and Steve and I became very, very close friends. And he came over on the res, and especially during the winter time, ice fishing time, we caught hundreds of big northern pike we'd catch 7, 8 every time he'd come. Between 9 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we were going to catch. And these, when I say big fish, I'm talking about fish that weigh 3.5 to 7, 8, 10, 12 pounds. Just fantastic fishing. Well, in turn, when it came hunting time, I would come over here to his ranch, and we would deer hunt together, and antelope hunt some too, but started deer hunting. And so one day I was over here, and we drove by the ranch here, and Steve kind of smiled, and he said, "You know what, Harold?" He said, "I had a dream last night." And I said, "Oh, you did?" He said, "Yeah, and it was about you." And I said, "Okay, what kind of a dream did you have?" He said, "You see that old house up there on the hill?" He said, "God told me that was going to be your retirement home." And I laughed at him because I'd been up here. I'd seen this place. First thing is, there's steps up to get up to the ground level. Up to the floor level. And then all there was at that time was this 26 by 26 square house with this little room, 8-foot room out here on the side of it, and 2 stories high. And I was having knee trouble, and for me to climb steps, even to get into my house, and I just laughed at him, and I said, "Well," I said, "it was a good dream, Steve." And he said, "No, seriously." He said, "You need to think about that because it's going to sell within the next year." And so he said, "You really need to check into." I said, "Well, how much money are they asking?" And he said, "They're asking just for the house and for the acreage that would kind of 130 acres that would kind of divide it up." He said they're asking $36,500 for it. And I said, "Well," I said, "you ever know?" I said, "You've known me a long time. You know how much money I got, and not that kind." And he kept laughing, but he said, "Well, you need to check into it." And so I checked with my banker in Rushville, and they wouldn't even talk to me about it. And so we just kind of left it at that. And but Steve started that back then, and that was in '88. And now I want to kind of shift here just a little bit, and I want to share some experiences that happened while we were in Pine Ridge that weren't really dated, that I can't really put a date on, but they were experiences that we had. We had a neighbor that got a couple of goats. They were little goats, and of course there were no fences and no yards, and these crazy goats were everywhere, and they grew up to be big goats. Well, I don't know how much experience you've had with goats, but the experiences I'd had my neighbor down in Oklahoma when I was among the Kickapoos, I had an experience with goats in which one of them almost hit my daughter, Barbara. And so these goats were around into everything. And they got to coming into my yard, and I had a bunch of elm trees. They weren't very big, 4, 8 inches around. But those crazy things would start in, and they would start the bark. They would eat the bark, and they would strip it, they would jerk it, and then strip it 10 feet high. And they were killing my trees. And I talked to him about his goats, and so one day he and I were talking, Richard and I were talking, and I said, Richard, I said, would you sell those goats? They were full grown, Billy and a Nanny. And he said, yeah. I said, what would you have to have for them? And he said, I'd take $15 a piece for them. Sold. And so I said, my backyard's fenced, so bring them by. So he brought them by, and we put them in the backyard, and he brought some hay, and he brought some oats that he had, and all kinds of food for them, and I thanked him for them. As soon as he left, I grabbed the Nanny, and of course they were pets, handy, and so I led her up the back porch of our house, and we had about 4 steps that came up, and then about a 4 by 4 porch, 5 by 5, and then there was enclosed a porch about 6 foot, a room about 5 foot wide and about 6 or 7 foot long, where you come in, and then the door into the kitchen led off of it. And I'd been hanging deer. I had a rack, a board where I'd been hanging deer. It was cooler out there, so I led that old Nanny up there, and I had a ball peen hammer, a big ball peen hammer, weighed about 1.5 pounds. And I thought, I'll just take this ball peen hammer with the ping and hit her in the head, and while she's knocked down, I'll cut her throat. I'll take care of her. And I grabbed her by the horn and cracked her in the head, and she just stood there. Yeah! And I hit her again. Yeah! And I hit her the 3rd time, and I hit her hard, right in the forehead. Yeah! I told Delo, I said, Delo, hand me that knife. So I cut her throat, and I hung on to her right there on my back porch and let her bleed, and took her in and hung her. Well, I knew what the deal was, so I immediately took the Billy and got him by the horn down below. And these would weigh, well, they butchered out 50 pounds apiece. And so I hung them, and Ann and Jim Taft were friends of ours, members of our church and school teachers, and they were kind of having a hard time, and Ann asked me, she said, what are you going to do with those goats? And I said, well, I'm going to grind them into hamburger. And she said, well, what after that? And I said, I guess I'm going to give it to some of my kids and eat some of it myself. And she said, would you sell it? And I said, sure, I'd sell it. And she said, well, what would you take for it? And I said, well, I'd take 30 cents a pound. It'd be $30 because there's 100 pounds of meat. And so they bought it. And Ann told me later, she said, it said it got so bad that we could hardly stand to eat that goat. But I ate some of it. It was good. But anyway, Ann and Jim ate those goats. But that took care of the goat situation in our backyard. And we had an outside water faucet at our house, and people began to come and get water at our house. And you could hear that water run all hours of the night and day. And there was at least a dozen families that got their water at our house. And of course, the water would freeze up, and the faucets would go bad, and there was all kinds of hassles with it. But it was an opportunity to share with people, and we made friends through this. I had a garden. Eventually, I had a garden out north of my house, and I had all kinds of vegetables in it, of course, and I got to noticing that I was losing carrots, and I got to looking around, and on my north fence, the kids somewhere had got a hold of a big pair of pliers, and they cut a hole in my fence about 2 foot square where they could crawl through and get into my garden and pull my carrots. And I kept telling them, I said, kids, I said, leave them alone till they grow up, and then we'll share them with you. And we used to raise the big giant sunflowers, and they'd break the flowers off. And I said, leave them alone, and I said, we'll roast them and let you have them, and we did. And eventually got through to the kids, and but it was kind of a weird experience. Along during that time, we had a girl, Carla Yellowboy, that came to our church. She was, I guess, 16, 17 years old, long in there somewhere, and we had worked with her, and I got a phone call one night from Mike Marable, who was an Indian boy there that eventually began to preach some, and he called and told me that Carla had been shot, and so I went to the hospital, and he met me there, and when I walked in, the ambulance driver, Essie, knew me, and man, she said, preacher, you need to come with me. And first thing I knew, I was in the emergency room, and they had Carla on the bed, and had she had a hole about that big around, about 3/4 to an inch around, right close to her heart, and blood was just running out of it like everything. And the doctors had 2 blood transfusions going at the same time, with pressure, blood pressure cuffs on them, pressure to where it was forcing blood in, and the blood was coming out as fast as it went in. And I was there in the room with Carla as she died, and the doctors were men who came to our church. I mean, I had a good relationship, and the doctor that was working with her, he said, "Come on, Carla, cry," and I listened to him, and this is one of the things that just bugs me nowadays. There's so much emphasis on these cop shows and this and emergency rooms in hospitals and this. I don't have to watch those things. I've seen them firsthand, and there's nothing there for me. But I watched Carla as life flowed out of her, and it was over. Somebody showed up at their house and was mad, and she was shot, and it was just a tragic thing. We had a bunch of neighbors. Well, our whole neighborhood, but we had some kids that lived across the street north of our church, the Backwardses, and Mr. and Mrs. Backward had about, at least 7 or 8 kids, but there was 2 of them, Alan, and then his sister, that came to our church quite a bit, and Alan especially. There was other boys and girls, and they came occasionally, but Alan came, and he went to all the Royal Ambassador camps, and he went to Falls Creek with me, and even to this day he comes by and visits with us occasionally, and he has become a firefighter. He's in charge of the firefighting on the reservation, and he's become a close friend. We had opportunity to lead him to the Lord, but he's not following the Lord very closely with his life. But the pressure that he had, the peer pressure of Indian people on one another is just an unbelievable thing. They put so much pressure on one another to drink. I had a fellow one time that I said, where do you get the money? I said, you're spending all kinds of money for this booze. And he said, it don't cost me nothing. He said, I got friends. And he said, I don't have to have any money to get drunk. But of course, the other side of that, when he had money, he bought it for them. But the thing I want to share here with Alan, Alan became so involved with us and with our children and with the activities that we did in the church that his parents began to really put pressure on him. I don't know how many times he was told, well, if you think so much of Heiney's, why don't you just go live with them? Why don't you just leave? And Thelma, his sister, very much came under the same pressures, and that makes it even worse. I mean, you can talk about peer pressure, but when you get pressure from parents, and yet today, now his father has died. His mother's still alive, and her nickname's Tiny. Tiny is the closest of our friends today. She makes the most delicious popovers you ever saw in your life. They're about 7-8 inches long and about 3.5-4 inches wide, and they're made out of light bread dough, and rolled real thin and turned over to leave a pouch. And in that pouch they put hamburger and cheese and maybe some tomatoes and beans. And if you're ever in Pine Ridge during the weekdays, over around the Taco John's along that line, there'll be a car parked about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning until they sell out. And these popovers used to be $1 a piece. Now they're, I don't know, $2.50, $3.50. But some of the best eating you'll ever eat in your life. And but I can call her, and she will have. I can buy 30 of them from her, and she'll make them special for me. And now she's passed this on to her children and her grandchildren. And so, but we had this experience with Alan and his family.